There are days that pass through history like a passing wind. But there are also days when the entire sky stops just to listen to one human being speak. November 2nd, 2025 was one of those days. Ouagadougou wasn't only glowing under the blazing Sahel sun, it was glowing because of something Africa had waited for over centuries, a truth spoken aloud, without fear, without hesitation, without compromise. From early morning, the central square was packed, not because a national ceremony was happening. People came because they felt that something would change that afternoon, not just for Burkina Faso, but for half the world that had stayed silent for far too long. In the dry, fire-hot air, the drums of the Sahel echoed from afar. Mothers held their children close. Young women pulled their scarves against the Sunday. Men stood in silence, eyes fixed on the stage where the red, green, yellow flag was trembling like a heart about to speak. And then he appeared. Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest leader in Africa, walked out with no heavy ring of guards, no horns, no displays of power. Just him, a simple black microphone, and millions of eyes placing all their hope in him. But inside that simplicity was something larger than everything around it, the stillness before a storm of justice. When he placed his hand on the microphone, the square went silent like a lake, without a single ripple. There was something different in his eyes, not the gaze of a president, but of a man who had seen a suffering the world refused to look at. Then he spoke. Not a greeting, not the usual ceremonial opening, but a sentence that made the entire space explode in silence. If men are the backbone of a nation, then women are its heartbeat. A short sentence, but it fell like thunder in a clear sky. Not poetry, not decoration, but a direct strike against traditions hard as stone, ancient beliefs that chained millions of African women and women everywhere into silence, fear, and humiliation. The women closest to the stage looked up. Some elderly women clutched their headscarves. Young girls gasped softly. No one expected that sentence, especially from the president of a Muslim nation in the most conservative part of West Africa. But that sentence was only the doorway. What lay behind it was the storm. Because on November 2, Traoré did not simply read a speech. He was about to expose 8 wounds that had pressed on the soul of African women for centuries, 8 truths that even the strongest leaders had never dared to speak. From bloody rituals hidden under the mask of tradition, from humiliations disguised as honor checks, from forced marriages that turned childhood into a bargaining chip, from religion used as chains instead of light, from the silence of the law, from the invisibility of women in education, politics, and the military, from the fear of war passed from mother to daughter. That day, everything would be called by its true name. But before those truths were spoken, something happened. Something no one standing in that square would ever forget. For the first time, all of Ouagadougou held its breath. And if you want to know why an entire continent went silent to listen, follow me into the next part of this story. Don't leave. And if what comes next touches your heart, remember to comment and subscribe so this awakening can reach even further. To understand why November 2nd became a turning point, we have to go back to the moments that quietly forged the man named Ibrahim Traoré. Because a speech cannot shake an entire continent unless the heart of the speaker was shaken long before. Many years before he stood in the center of Ouagadougou like a torch of his era, Traoré was just an ordinary Sahel boy. He grew up in burning wind and dust, in a poor family, with a mother who stayed silent more than she spoke. He didn't understand why her eyes were always red late at night, why her voice sank every time news came of a girl in the village being forced into marriage, or why her hands trembled whenever neighbors talked about a little girl being taken away to perform the cleansing ritual. Those questions grew up with him, and his mother's silence was his first lesson. The day his mother died, Traoré said he didn't cry. He only stood there, watching the thin hands that raised him close for the last time. But what haunted him for years wasn't her death, it was something far simpler. His mother had carried a lifetime of pain in silence, and society saw that as normal. As he grew older, became a soldier, and then one of the youngest members of the Special Forces, Traoré witnessed things most people cannot imagine. He walked through villages where 9-year-old girls were led into tiny mud houses, where a rusty blade decided their future. He saw 12-year-old girls holding babies, though they themselves had never known what childhood meant. And he heard mothers say, "It's tradition, it's destiny." No one dared protest. No one dared call it violence. No one dared say it out loud. During the years of war in the north, every time he returned to the base, Traoré heard the female nurses talk about childbirth cases in conditions that defied belief. Each time he saw a young girl die simply because she had no access to medical care, he remembered his mother. And one thought kept tearing at him. How can a nation grow strong when half of its people are treated as if they were born to endure suffering? Then came the day he became the leader of Burkina Faso. Glory wasn't what he sought. Power was not his aim. What he saw first was not the presidential seat, but the eyes of the women of Burkina Faso. The women carrying water along red dirt roads, the little girls standing by the school window but not allowed to enter, the mothers tending their own wounds after being beaten by their husbands, the wives crying quietly when they learned their daughters would soon be forced into marriage. And he understood, if he stayed silent, he would become part of the same cycle that swallowed his mother's childhood. Until one night, while reading a classified report on gender-based violence in the Sahel, Traoré closed the file and told his advisors a sentence that froze the entire room. "Women are not weak. It is society that has never been strong enough to protect them." And that was the moment he decided, on November 2nd, he would speak for every woman who could not speak. He knew saying it would spark controversy. He knew it could clash with tradition, religion, and politics. So he knew extremists would call it betrayal. But he also knew something far more important. There are truths that, if not spoken at the right time, will destroy a nation. And that is why he stepped onto the stage that day, not as a president, but as the son of a mother who stayed silent her entire life. When Ibrahim Traoré stood before the sea of people in the golden afternoon of Ouagadougou, everyone thought he would begin with the usual formal greetings the diplomatic language leaders often use to fill space before important announcements. But he didn't. He didn't wait for the Sahel drums to stop. He didn't wait for the flag to settle. He didn't wait for the noise of the crowd to fade completely. He looked straight into thousands of faces, from mothers with white headscarves to young girls pressed behind the barricades, and spoke a sentence that made every sound drop like stone. "If men are the backbone of a nation, then women are its heartbeat." No one had time to breathe. That sentence hit the air like fire, touching oil, spreading fast, rising high, and impossible to put out. Some men frowned, a few women burst into tears, and the young girls looked at one another, unsure if what they heard could be real. A president in the conservative Sahel, beginning with a declaration of women's worth, a sentence that had only ever appeared in human rights forums in the West, never from the heart of West Africa. But for Traoré, that line wasn't meant to shock. It was a vow. Then he continued, this time in a deeper voice, like a man lifting stones off the chest of an entire culture. The strength of a nation doesn't come from guns, army size, or treaties. Strength begins in the home, where a mother teaches her child that dignity is not something given. It is a way of living. A wave of murmurs rippled across the square. He wasn't just talking about women. He was resetting the moral foundation of a continent. To show that his words were not empty slogans, Traoré spoke of women who had changed history but were forgotten too quickly. He spoke of Fatoumata Tambajang, the woman who dared to rise in Gambia when the entire nation was drowning in fear, the woman who helped thousands of girls escape forced marriage. He spoke of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the Liberian woman who rebuilt a nation destroyed by war and brought home the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize. Then he said a sentence that made many swallow hard. They are not great because they are women. They are great because they had the courage to do what is right. Silence fell again, not a silence of restraint, but a silence of realization. A silence that forces people to confront themselves. He didn't stop there. Traoré quoted Eleanor Roosevelt, something unheard of in a West African presidential speech. Human rights begin in small places, close to home, where mothers teach their children right from wrong. But when he said it, everyone felt he wasn't borrowing Western words. He was returning a message to its rightful source. Freedom doesn't belong to any continent. It belongs to human dignity. Then his voice dropped heavy as stone. Today, I am not here to praise the past, because on November 12th, Traoré did not simply read a speech. He was about to expose 8 wounds that had pressed on the soul of African women for centuries, 8 truths that even the strongest leaders had never dared to speak. From bloody rituals hidden under the mask of tradition, from humiliations disguised as honor checks, from forced marriages that turned childhood into a bargaining chip, from religion used as chains instead of light, from the silence of the law. And he ended the opening with a declaration that pierced the sky like a spear. I will speak of the 8 wounds of African women. 8 wounds no leader before me dared to name. 8 wounds that turned silence into heritage and pain into tradition. The entire square stood on the edge of a new era. People didn't just hear those words. They felt them like a blade cutting through the invisible chains that had bound them for hundreds of years. I am here to speak of the wounds we have left on the bodies of the women who raised us. The square shuddered. What came next was no longer politics, no longer religion, no longer tradition. It was truth. A truth too painful to speak, but too necessary to silence. Traoré turned toward the women standing near the barricades, eyes trained to endure, shoulders trained to carry water, hands trained to wash their own blood after forced rituals. It dropped lower, like a man opening a door behind which lay pains that did not belong to one woman, but to an entire culture. The first wound, silence dressed as tradition. He spoke of villages where a dull blade cuts the bodies of 9-year-old girls, not for medicine, not for faith, but for an ancient ritual passed from one generation to the next. He said, "We teach our daughters that pain is the doorway to dignity." But God never asked for their blood. Many women covered their faces and cried. They understood. They had been there. The second wound, the obsession called virginity. He spoke of virginity tests, a humiliation hidden under the name honor. Girls forced to lie down under the eyes of others, as if their bodies were public property. He said, "We protect a thin membrane more than we protect the dignity of our own children." Men bowed their heads. For the first time, they faced a truth they had always considered normal. And the third wound, forced marriage. Traoré spoke of 12-year-old girls married off in exchange for a few bags of grain, a cow, or promises no one intended to keep. Entire childhoods erased behind a husband's door before the girls even learned their multiplication tables. A nation cannot speak of its future if it steals the future of its daughters. The Sahel wind carried the quiet sobs of mothers who once watched their daughters taken away. The fourth wound, faith turned into chains. He made it clear. Religion was not the problem. The problem was those who used religion to control women. He said, "A woman who chooses to wear a veil is free. A woman forced to wear one is a prisoner." Believers did not protest. They knew he was speaking the truth no one had dared to say aloud. And that was the moment the fire of the speech began to burn. Unstoppable, uncontainable, and irreversible. When the words 8 wounds left Traoré's lips, the entire square tightened like a held breath. No one knew what he was about to say. No one knew how far he would go. And no one expected that right after that moment, Burkina Faso, a country where tradition is placed above every question, was about to face the rawest truth of itself. His voice was no longer powerful like before. The sixth wound, women blamed for the sins of humanity. He spoke of the story of Adam and Eve, but in a way no one in West Africa had ever heard. There is no Eve who made Adam fall. There are only men who refuse to take responsibility for their own actions. Even Islamic scholars nodded. For the first time, they heard religion freed from distortion. The seventh wound, being shut out of power, he asked the crowd, why could the women in the time of the prophet lead, fight, teach, yet modern women cannot? No one answered. There was no excuse left. The eighth wound, violence the deepest wound. When he reached the final wound, his voice cracked. War does not only kill men on the battlefield, it kills the peace inside a mother's heart. He announced the creation of the National Commission Against Gender-Based Violence. West Africa, where Russia continues to deepen its ties, and had become a promise. When the eighth wound was spoken, the square fell into absolute silence. No one shouted, no one resisted, no one walked away, because everyone understood one thing. When truth is finally spoken, healing can finally begin. When Ibrahim Traoré spoke the eighth wound aloud, the square was still drowning in a silence as heavy as Sahel sand at noon. But it was no longer the silence of fear, or of traditions that chain human beings with darkness. It was the silence of a heart, realizing it had just heard something that should have been spoken long ago. And in that very moment, Traoré changed his voice. He no longer stood like a man exposing pain. He stood like a man lighting the lamp of faith, a faith buried under the dust of time for far too long. He looked at the crowd, at the faces carved by history, sacrifice, dry seasons, and nights without electricity, but also at faces carrying the most beautiful thing the Sahel ever produced, the resilience of people who survive what the world cannot imagine. He said, "No wound lasts forever if the light of faith is allowed to shine on it." But the light he spoke of was not the light of rigid religion, nor the light of doctrines used to turn fear into obedience. It was the light of conscience, the only thing that can change the destiny of a nation without a single bullet. Then he spoke of his military missions across northern Burkina Faso, where the sound of gunfire mixed with prayers in dusty red evenings. He heard the men reciting scripture, but he also heard the cries of women behind mud walls, silently enduring lives they never chose. Faith is not a chain, he said. Faith is the path that helps people reclaim their dignity. And hundreds of religious leaders in the crowd nodded, not because he convinced them, but because they felt freed from their own fear, the fear that if they spoke the truth, they would be accused of betraying tradition. Traoré continued, "If a belief forces half the nation to live with bowed heads, it is not a belief. It is a misunderstanding that must be healed." The words "healed" fell like soft rain. It was no longer the voice of a leader issuing warnings. It was the voice of a son speaking to his people. He reminded them of the time of the prophet, when women were allowed to study, trade, and even carry arms to defend their community. Then he asked, if the 7th century was brave enough to give women power, why is the 21st century more cowardly? The entire square gasped not at the boldness of the line, but at the truth of it. For the first time, Burkina Faso saw the past not as an excuse to protect prejudice, but as a reminder that civilization only exists when people dare to move forward. Traoré raised his hand high, as if lifting the entire square with his bare palms. He spoke slowly, each word clear, like the beat of a Sahel drum. Awakening does not come from abroad. It begins in the hearts of the people standing on this land. A hot wind blew through, spinning dust around everyone's feet. But no one closed their eyes. No one turned away. They wanted to witness what was beginning right in that moment. Then his voice grew stronger, as if fueled by something deeper. I am not here to condemn tradition. I am here to free tradition from the things that never belonged to it. Women wrapped their arms around one another. Scholars bowed their heads. Men clenched their fists, and something Africa had lost for far too long began to return. The belief that change is possible. But Traoré knew this. Faith without action dies like a seed never watered. And so, once conscience had been awakened, he moved to what no one in the world expected. The largest action plan in Burkina Faso's history for its women. When the final echo of the awakening faded, everyone thought the speech was about to end. Usually, after powerful accusations, leaders step down and leave the crowd to face their own shock. But Traoré did not step down. He stood for one more breath, looking across the square as if he wanted to carve into memory every face waiting for something greater. And then he said the sentence that would make the world stand still and listen. Truth only heals when it is turned into action. In that moment, his voice was no longer unlocking pain. It was opening the door to the future. He announced the first program, the one later known worldwide as the Mother River Fund, a national fund dedicated to women, not to hand out subsidies, but to give power. He said, a woman with a job is a family that does not collapse. A woman with income is a nation held firm at its roots. Through the Mother River Fund, Burkina Faso would open cashew processing factories, cotton treatment facilities, traditional textile production centers. More than 50,000 women in remote areas would have stable jobs for the first time in their life. Women who once had to depend on their husbands or sell their daughters for food would now stand on production lines as pillars of their families. The crowd erupted in applause, not because of policy, but because they had never heard anyone say that the dignity of women could become an engine of economic growth. Traoré raised his arm high and moved to the next point: education. In the Sahel, that is not a simple word. It is life and death, hope and hardship. He declared that starting in 2026, gender studies, reproductive health, ethics, and human rights would be integrated into the national curriculum. No more whispering in classrooms, no more hiding knowledge, no more treating women's bodies as taboo. A society that refuses to educate its daughters, he said, is a society cutting off half of its future. Then came the announcement that stunned many: a special court for gender-based violence. He did not soften it. He did not hesitate. He was not vague. From today, we will no longer call violence family conflict. We will call it what it is: a crime. This time, the applause was not loud. It was deep, so deep that even many men nodded silently. Then he spoke of healthcare, the quietest wound of Sahel women. 200 maternal and child health centers built with UNICEF and WHO. In places where childbirth meant gambling with death, women would now have the chance to choose safety over fate. But just as everyone thought the plan was complete, Traoré lit another unexpected flame: the Fatoumata Traoré Scholarship, named after his mother, for girls pursuing science, technology, and defense. Knowledge is the only key no one can take from a woman's hands. And finally, the point once considered impossible: the Women's Security Academy, a national training program for female officers, strategists, military engineers. He said, "A woman who protects her nation is a woman who protects every home within it." The entire square rose to its feet, not because of the military aspect, but because, for the first time, women were seen as protectors, not just the protected. When Traoré finished, he did not smile. He let silence find its own way into the heart of every person, because everyone understood this was not a promise. It was the blueprint for liberating half of humanity. When Ibrahim Traoré finished announcing the action plan, the entire square stood still. No one left. No one spoke. The Sahel wind drifted gently through the air, as if nature itself was trying to remember every word he had just said. And then, from a single, solitary clap, the entire square erupted. The cheers slammed against the walls of the buildings, rose into the golden evening sky, and spread outward like a wave born in the heart of Ouagadougou, rolling across all of Burkina Faso, but the impact didn't stop at national borders. The next morning, before the sun could push through the Sahel dust clouds, the recording of the speech appeared on international platforms. And almost instantly, major news outlets ran headlines that were strangely similar: Burkina Faso redefines leadership. Across global social media, clips from the speech spread like fire meeting wind. The line, "Women are the heartbeat of a nation," landed on the homepages of dozens of major newspapers. Western scholars shared analysis after analysis. Commentators from Asia, Latin America, and even the Middle East asked the same question: why didn't this sentence come from a world power? Why did it come from a small nation in the Sahel? In New York, the UN Women Office posted a tweet with only 2 sentences: "A leader is not measured by the power he holds, but by the dignity he protects." Section. Underneath were 3 hashtags: Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, Africa is speaking. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of shares from every corner of the world. But the biggest shock came from places no one expected. In the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV sent a direct message: "A man who listens to the suffering of the vulnerable is a man listening to the voice of God." In Pakistan, a famous Islamic scholar shared the quote about faith never being a chain. He wrote, "He is not attacking religion. He is returning religion to its original purpose." In Nigeria and Senegal, conservative imams who had never supported gender reform expressed rare respect. For the first time, they saw a young leader speak about women's rights through the language of faith, not the language of confrontation. Meanwhile, in Liberia and Gambia, journalists wrote that Traoré was continuing the legacy of the women who once changed their nations. Headlines appeared: "From Sirleaf to Traoré, Africa is rewriting the world's moral compass." And in the United States, in living rooms from Texas to California, older viewers sat quietly in front of their evening news. They were used to seeing Africa only through images of poverty, war, corruption. But now for the first time they saw a different Africa. Strong, confident, principled, leading. A news editor in Washington said on the nightly broadcast, "Perhaps the world's moral center is no longer in Paris or London. Perhaps it is shifting south." In Geneva, at the Human Development Forum, Traoré was invited not as the youngest president in Africa, but as the conscience of a continent. And then, something remarkable happened. For the first time in decades, Western scholars cited the ideas of an African leader to build new theories. A report was published titled The Traoré Doctrine. Main principle: when women are protected, a nation becomes unbreakable. Not just the media, not just the scholars, even politicians who once looked at Africa with condescension had to change their tone. Traoré didn't just surprise the world, he earned its respect, and that respect is worth more than any foreign aid. It was the voice of a son speaking to his people. He reminded them of the time of the Prophet, when women were allowed to study, trade, and even carry arms to defend their community. Then he asked, if the 7th century was brave enough to give women power, why is the 21st century more cowardly? The entire square gasped not at the boldness of the line, but at the truth of it. And it all began with one speech in Ouagadougou. Africa looked at itself again. In Kenya, students at the University of Nairobi held banners reading, "Justice has a voice, and it speaks in our language." In Tanzania, a journalist said on live television, "We have grown used to being lectured. Today, we heard a reminder from our own brother." In Senegal, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Friday sermons in mosques quoted Traoré's words on religion and dignity. Many imams said openly, "This is the voice we have waited for, not from Europe, not from America, but from the Sahel itself." Africa began to awaken, not with slogans, but with dignity. Those who were once silent began to speak. Women's organizations from Ghana to Ethiopia sent letters of thanks. Human rights groups in Algeria and Morocco issued joint statements. In Rwanda, a member of parliament said on television, "We were once the people who were taught." A report was published titled The Traoré Doctrine. Main principle: when women are protected, a nation becomes unbreakable. Not just the media, not just the scholars, even politicians who once looked at Africa with condescension had to change their tone. Traoré didn't just surprise the world, he earned its respect, and that respect is worth more than any foreign aid. And Africa was now seen through a completely different lens, a continent of resilience, intelligence, compassion, and dignity. And at that winter session of the African Union, when Ibrahim Traoré walked into the hall, all the leaders stood up. No instruction, no choreography, no protocol. They stood because they understood. A new era had begun, not the era of weapons, not the era of oil or natural resources, but the era of ethical leadership. A delegate from Rwanda said, "We once thought power rested in guns. He showed us that power rests in what is right." The world recognized what it had never admitted. In European forums, people discussed the moral soft power of Burkina Faso. In strategic meetings in the United States, experts asked, "Are we falling behind Africa in leadership standards?" In France, op-eds appeared. Burkina Faso teaches the West a lesson in dignity. Today, we are the people teaching the world about compassion. A South African analyst exclaimed, "We used to borrow Europe's words to speak to each other. Today, the world borrows our words to speak to itself." It was a historic moment. Africa rose from its own soil, no longer the continent in need of saving, no longer the continent defined by poverty, no longer the continent of instability. And in the UK, an Oxford professor said, "If the moral code of the 21st century is to be rewritten, it will begin in the Sahel." These were not compliments. They were truths the world was finally forced to face. And at the center of this awakening stood a man who never wanted to be a symbol. Ibrahim Traoré never claimed he wanted to lead Africa. He only wanted to speak the truth. But that truth was so powerful that the entire continent shifted. That afternoon in Ouagadougou, after the speech finally ended, the sun was almost touching the horizon. The last light of the day fell across the red clay rooftops, across the thin shoulders of people who had stood for hours just to hear one man speak about them, speak for them, speak in a language they had waited generations to hear. In that moment, the chairs had long dissolved into the Sahel wind, but the quiet remained. A quiet, not of submission, but of hearts slowly realizing that today they were not only listened to, they were seen. Mothers walked out of the square holding their children, their eyes different from when they arrived. Young girls walked in groups, talking, laughing, then falling silent again as if carrying something new inside them, something that had never existed before. And while the world analyzed political impacts, debated ideological meanings, or wondered how a small nation could create such a massive effect, the people of Burkina Faso said only one sentence. This was the first time we heard a leader speak for those who have no voice. And that was the moment the world understood. Dignity, when spoken with truth, can change the position of an entire continent. In that silence, he understood that everything he said today, from the 8 wounds to the action plans, was only the beginning. Because truth does not change the world. Action changes the world. And that responsibility did not belong to him alone. It belonged to every mother rocking her child to sleep. It belonged to every young girl who, for the first time, believed she had the right to dream. It belonged to every man who understood that protecting women does not make him weaker, it makes him the true backbone of a nation. It belonged to every citizen of Burkina Faso, and to every person listening to this story, wherever they are in the world. On international television that day, news ran non-stop. But in Ouagadougou, the loudest sound was not the cameras, it was the sound of awakening, a sound many wealthy nations had lost, but a small country in the heart of the Sahel had found again. Dignity. Dignity does not come from military strength. It does not come from GDP. It does not come from international status. It comes from the courage to look at your people's suffering and call it by its true name. As the sun set and golden dust drifted along the roads, people went home with the feeling that tomorrow would be different. Not because of a miracle, but because for the first time they believed that change was something they could touch. And that was the true power of the speech. A speech that did not end with applause. It began with the fierce silence of millions. A silence from which a shared promise rose. No one will ever be silent again.